I want to be clear with you all that a new day has come. To San Francisco, to Oakland, to Baltimore, to Ferguson, to Atlanta, there is a movement sweeping this country, and we are not going to stop until you stop killing us.
Shut it down! Shut it down! The time for the middle ground is over.
What's happening, family? This is Law and Disorder. I'm your host, Kat Brooks. A few years ago, while I was still co-hosting Up Front, I began to notice and we began to cover the rise of right-wing movements and governments in Europe, France, Italy, Spain. However, we were looking at the material conditions in each country individually rather than searching for the connecting threads. Since that time, the United States has seen the arrival of a hard-right, anti-immigrant, black, brown, poor, queer, female movement and government. Our guest this morning will help us unpack these swings to the right as not random happenstances, but rather the impacts of a political theory at play, replacement theory. Our guest this morning is Dr. Ibram X Kendi. Kendi is the Carter G. Woodson Endowed Chair in History and the inaugural director of the Howard University Institute for Advanced Study, an interdisciplinary research enterprise examining global racism. He is the author of the National Book Award, winning Stamped from the Beginning, and the international bestseller, How to Be an Antiracist, and has been awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, popularly known as the Genius Grant. His latest book, which we are discussing this morning, is Chain of Ideas, The Origins of Our Authoritarian Age. Good morning, and thank you for joining.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
When you use the term authoritarian age, Dr. Kendi, what are the markers globally that make that so?
Well, according to recent data, nearly 3/4 of the world's population is living under an authoritarian state. And these are authoritarian states typically led by leaders that are actively seeking to or have already eroded democracy. And I would argue that many of these leaders are trying to actually get people to consent to living within an authoritarian state, trying to get people to consent for their states becoming increasingly militarized, from rights and freedoms being taken away. And the major theory that's being used to get people to consent to their own domination is great replacement theory, as I write about in Chain of Ideas. And very quickly, this is a political theory that suggests that there are these globalist elites who are enabling peoples of color to displace the lives and livelihoods and even electoral power of white people who apparently therefore need authoritarian protection. And so when we hear phrases like immigrants are invading the nation, we're hearing great replacement theory, or diversity programs are discriminatory, or there's an internal enemy. We're hearing a theory that's trying to get people to believe they need protection, they need someone to save them. And then the authoritarian comes around and says, I will protect you and I will save you by snatching your freedoms and rights.
Who are these globalist elites that in theory are pushing this wicked agenda forward, and why would they be doing so?
Well, that is different in different countries, but usually the political party that is pushing this theory is typically positioning a political party to the left as the cornerstone of these global elites. And so whether that is a center-right party, a center-left party, or even, a leftist party, but they also argue that NATO, European Union, international organizations more broadly are part of this globalist elite. And I should say the construct of the globalist elite comes directly from the construct of international Jewry. And so there's that apparently Nazis imagined that there was this extremely wealthy, powerful Jewish cabal that was ruling the world and facilitating the annihilation of Aryans. And ironically, those who are articulating great replacement theory, though they've dropped the Jewish part of it, are making a similar case today.
Talk to us about origins of the replacement theory. Well, I guess because you say reemergence, so I guess talk to us about Camus.
Well, Camus, Renaud Camus, is a novelist and poet in France who, in 2011, he published a book entitled The Great Replacement. And he imagined in that book that African immigrants who were primarily Muslim were coming in mass and overtaking and displacing, quote unquote, white native Europeans. And he argued that this marked the Great Replacement. And he argued this, frankly, was happening across the world, particularly in the global north. And so he named a theory that actually had been around for quite some time. So theories are different than humans in that when we're born, we're typically named around the time we're born. Theories can be around for more than a century before they're named. And this is a theory that has been around for quite some time. I mentioned Nazis, their articulation of it. Jim Crow segregationists, apartheid officials articulated forms of Great Replacement theory. But it really was first conjured in its totality by white supremacist colonial officials who began to imagine in the late 1800s what would happen if they were no longer colonizing Africa or Asia or Latin America. And they imagined that there would be this turning of the table or this replacement in which those people who were fighting for their freedom, that they wouldn't stop at their sovereignty and at their liberation, that they apparently would then come to Europe, engage in genocides, and seek to take over Europe. And that was really the origin story of what we now call Great Replacement theory.
In that book that you mentioned by Camus, you say that in it he has three protagonists: the replacers, the replacees, the replaces. Can you walk us through each of those three?
Sure. So if we think of the definition, the first major form of the definition is this powerful sort of body, or the replacist. These are the people who are enabling the replacement. So in the case of, let's say, the United States, you have Tucker Carlson, who has argued that the Democratic Party is actively importing voters from, I should say, immigrants from Latin America and Africa to get them to be able to vote and display the power of white native Americans. That's a theory he pushed for years on his show. So he positioned the Democratic Party as the replacists who were enabling the replacement, apparently. And then he positioned the replacers as black and brown immigrants, and the replacees as white Americans.
Thank you for that. Let's expand a bit and have you talk about genocide theory, this offshoot of Great Replacement.
Sure. So, yeah, genocide theory is the most extreme Great Replacement theory. It is this theory that white people or another privileged or minority group are facing genocide and annihilation. In the case of the US context and even in parts of Europe, it's imagined that so-called black criminals, so-called immigrants of color, who, of course, this president has described as animals and rapists, and quote-unquote Islamic terrorists are enabling, are essentially behind the genocide of white Christians. And so whenever there is a quote-unquote form of black on white crime, as they say, they call it a marker of a genocide of white people, even as most white people are being harmed by other white people. Whenever there is an attack, a terror attack by, let's say, someone who happens to be Muslim, they argue that it is part of a larger sort of clash of civilizations where, Muslims are seeking to destroy, Christians, particularly white Christians. And what's also ironic about genocide theory is they also argue that white women who are choosing to not have children or to only have one or two children are also contributing to the genocide of white people by causing the quote unquote low birth rates among white people. And certainly, white women and women of color, and even men who are supportive of reproductive freedom and abortion rights, they argue are also contributing to the genocide of white people. But this theory extends even beyond the notion that white people are facing a genocide, because Great Replacement theory expands beyond even notions that white people are being replaced. So there's this construct in which apparently there's a war against men. Apparently there's a war against Christians. Apparently there's a war against ethnic majorities, whether it's the Hindu majority in India or the Han majority in China. Uh, there's even ideas that there's a war against heterosexuals. And so it's imagined that all of these groups apparently are facing a genocide when they are the least likely, typically in their countries, to face hate crimes.
And what's bananas is that I can just imagine, should all of us blacks get together and decide we was really gonna go for white folks, the backlash, the violence, like the price that we would pay. I mean, a lot of us dark joked, I guess, about January 6th, and had that been us,
Yeah,
had that been a Black Lives Matter rally, we wouldn't have gotten that close to the Capitol. And if we had, our blood would have been everywhere. Yeah.
exactly. And if I could just say very quickly, genocide theory has incited a whole host of mass shootings over the last 15 years. And I'm talking about the shooter who walked into a supermarket of black folks in Buffalo believed genocide theory. The shooter who entered the Walmart in El Paso, Texas, and murdered a large number of Latino Americans believed in genocide theory. The shooter who walked into a synagogue in Pittsburgh believed that Jews were enabling immigrants to slaughter his people. Uh, as an example. And even there's been mass shootings in Christchurch, New Zealand, in Oslo, Norway, in Munich. All over the world, people have been misled into believing that, quote unquote, their people were under attack. So then they picked up a gun to slaughter the people who they imagined or had been taught were seeking to slaughter them. So this is a dangerous theory. It's the most dangerous theory known to humanity.
And this might seem like a dumbed down question, but I'm gonna ask it anyway, right? We don't hear even so-called left-leaning media attribute these mass shootings, this white violence to this belief in these theories. You might be the first person I've heard posit as such.
And I think part of what's happening is that in many cases, even left leaning media runs with the trope of mental illness, um, which is typically a trope that is brought out to, frankly, um, what the way it actually operates is it actually covers up these violent theories that people hold. So even, and that's not just as it relates to race. I mean, even when a black man slaughters a black woman or a bunch of children, instead of saying, this is patriarchy and it's violence, right? Instead, they want to imagine that it's mental illness. And so, but I also think that many left leaning outlets don't really want to don't have not spent enough time speaking about and frankly informing viewers about propaganda, particularly this form of propaganda, because folks on the left, we really want to focus on material conditions and its impact, on how things are happening in society, which is to me incredibly important. But we have to show the relationship between material conditions and how people think.
You're listening to Law and Disorder. I'm your host, Kat Brooks, in conversation with Dr. Ibram X Kendi. He's got a new book out called Chain of Ideas, The Origins of Our Authoritarian Age. You break down, Dr. Kendi, some other articulations of the theory that you say may be even more politically dangerous. And I think this gets to what we're just talking about, how it seeps in and then we see these manifestations because it's more digestible by larger groups of folks. So you talk about the way it's defined through impacts on livelihood, culture, electoral power, and freedoms. If you could just riff off that for a second.
Yeah, let me give an example of livelihood. So many parts of the world right now, particularly in urban areas, are facing a housing crisis in which people are struggling to find housing or to find affordable housing. And so you have these great replacement politicians who are saying that the reason why you're struggling, meaning speaking to everyday people, to find affordable housing is because the immigrants are taking it all, or because the black people are receiving preferential treatment, from the government. And at the same time, those politicians are being heavily bankrolled by developers who are choosing to, or I should say, making a tremendous amount of money by taking scarce housing and creating 4 or 5 thousand square foot homes for one person or no one, right? And so if you're a politician who is being funded by someone whose policies, I should say, whose business is helping to create or maintain the housing crisis, you and them are going to want people to be blaming someone else as opposed to you. And that's how sort of great replacement theory is functioning, because people are facing real challenges in this moment. And what great replacement theory convinces people that the source of your challenges are those other people, or those people who are strangers, or those people you already don't like. Um, and I think that's what makes this theory so dangerous, because people's livelihoods are suffering right now at the hands of the super rich. And some of those people within the super rich are heavily financing politicians to tell people that they're suffering because of people who are suffering even more than they are.
Where in American history have we seen this before?
Well, we've seen it many times, but probably one of the more obvious times was after the Civil War. Uh, and I write about this in Chain of Ideas, how this was a time in which you had former Confederates and former enslavers uh, during the Reconstruction era trying to convince everyday white Southerners that when they saw a black politician, they saw someone who was trying to act against the interest of that everyday white person, and that when they saw them, these wealthy white landowners, that they were trying to act in their interest. But in actuality, those former enslavers refused to support public schooling during the enslaving South. They refused to support, their governments refused to support public defenders, institutions for people with disabilities. Many of the social safe elements of the social safety net was literally built during the Reconstruction era by black politicians, and it benefited the vast majority of white Southerners. At the same time, those who were trying to reclaim power were saying those very politicians were coming to harm them. And I think that's what's striking. Something even similar happened during, I think, the Obama era, in which a lot of Obama's policies actually helped a large percentage of white Americans. uh, and at the same time, those white Americans were being told, if there's a black person in office, he can't be helping you. He's harming you. He's taking from you. He's displacing you.
Thank you. I want to do some more correlation between then and now. You touched on it briefly in an earlier response, drawing the connection between Nazism to Great Replacement theory. And then you also talk about why neo or new Nazi is not exactly an accurate term for what we're
Yeah,
seeing today.
I wrote about how when most people think of the term neo-Nazi, they think of people today who are hailing Hitler or who are denying the Holocaust or who are uh, supporting, let's say, a genocidal anti Semitism or calling for the return of Nazi Germany. And I would say there's nothing neo about any of that. Like, that's just a Nazi. And there's nothing different than between them and certainly the people during the actual Nazi era. So, but it is new for one to say that we have to annihilate Muslims before the Muslims annihilate us. If Nazis said the same exact thing about Jews, right? It is new to say that uh, uh, we have to have a nation of one culture because to have a multicultural nation is to destroy, let's say, the cultures of white people. When Nazis said we have to have a nation of one blood, and to have other bloods in the quote unquote nation will poison and overwhelm and destroy the Aryan blood. It is new to go from blood to culture. Um, and it is new, as we talked about earlier, to remix the construct of international Jewry to a globalist elite trying to enable, the Great Replacement. So I show the ways in which these Nazi ideas have been renovated for a new age. And literally, they did a gut renovation of the house of Nazism, put up all new fixtures, all new walls, brought in all new furniture, and sold it to people. And people are buying into this neo Nazism, not fully understanding that the purpose of trying to get them to buy into the neo Nazism is so that they will buy into authoritarianism and so that they will buy into the undermining of democracy.
I'm gonna keep tugging at this thread because I have it here and actually want you to talk about it. Blood and soil then and blood and soil now. Because that's in the headlines and my listeners will go, oh,
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you know, the Nazis talked endlessly about what they called racial hygiene, and they argued that it was critical that the nation was constantly at guard to improve its racial hygiene, and that if you have these quote alien bloods like the blood of Jews or Slavs or others, or even black people, that it would undermine the racial hygiene. Similarly, the president of this country, once talked about that uh, black and brown immigrants were poisoning the blood of the nation. Um, and so the construct of blood and soil even still lives in current rhetoric.
in your prologue, you mentioned a website, whitedate.net. I would have never known about this website. I certainly would not have gone to this website were it not for you. So thank you so much. I do not recommend my listeners go to that website unless they have a vomit bag nearby. But I was struck by a couple of things. This connecting, this correlation of like let's find love, but it's rooted in this ideology of hate. It's so subtle. And that got me to thinking about, in addition to the political impacts of these ideologies, i.e., we've got that idiot in the White House, but it's not just him, right? All the policies that are coming out of this administration. What are perhaps some of the more quieter societal impacts that are moving that we may not that are not as visible?
Sure. So one of the conferences that I highlight in Chain of Ideas is the premier conference of what's called the proto-natal movement in the United States. And these are people who are trying to encourage white couples heterosexual couples, of course, to have more children. Uh, they believe that there's these declining. They are aghast at declining white birth rates, and so they're doing everything they can to increase those uh, birth rates among white people, and even having conferences and meeting about it. Uh, their most prominent supporter is none other than Elon Musk, who, of course, has 14 children that we know about, and imagines that every child he has, every white child that he has, is doing a service to the white race. So you have people who are literally procreating uh, or seeking to procreate, believing that that is saving the white race from genocide. Um, and that is, doesn't get more private and personal than that.
Considering on these quieter social impacts, self-righteous group that we are, the far left, we would believe that none of this touches us or the way that we think or, manifest in the way that we behave or treat each other. The toxicity of our side is a whole nother segment. But you note that polling shows that these political leanings can be embraced and are embraced by folks across the political spectrum. Can you say about how and why?
Yeah, so let me give an example. Uh, you know, it's interesting you mentioned this sort of toxicity in our spaces, because one thing I did not expect when I entered into our spaces is that there would be the level of competition that some people engage in, particularly with people in their sphere, right? So if you have a radio show, you have certain people who are competing with others who have radio shows, or in my case, if you write a book, they're sort of competing with other, because in my mind I see everyone as comrades, right? We're in this together, but there are people. Let's say there are particularly there are white people who have a tremendous amount of angst because they see a black person who is in their uh, area of work receiving more opportunity or more spotlight than them. And they see that black person as taking or replacing them. So even in our spaces, and then they, and one of the ways in which they show that is because then they obviously go and seek to take that black person down, because they feel that that black person is undeserving in the way that they believe they themselves are deserving. Or in the case of, you have someone who is African American who believes that black immigrants are coming and taking the jobs of African Americans, right? Or you believe that somebody who is writing books on racism uh, is taking space from you in your books on capitalism, even as those books can be in conversation, right? And should be. So it is certainly happening, within our spaces, and I think it's one of the reasons, certainly not the only, in which there's so much competition when there shouldn't be, in which people develop levels of resentment and even jealousy, and engage in sort of takedown behavior as a result.
When Trump ascended for a second regime, one of the things, I'm just riffing on something you said in terms of like Black Americans and Black immigrants, right? And we started to see the attacks on immigrants. Some of our cousins said, "This isn't our fight, not our issue," right? And then our response, and with my other hat at my other org, was, there's Black immigrants too. We're not just talking about Latinx people. And some of our cousin went, yeah, not our issue. And then listed out some of, sort of what you just said, our jobs are this or that. And so we've seen one of the most important political things that can happen or needs to happen this time is the beating back the white supremacist division between Black USCians, as Nana Gamfi says, and I love her, and Black immigrants.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I'm hoping people recognize, through reading Chain of Ideas, that the three main groups, there have been many, many groups that have been positioned as replacers, across the world, but the three main groups that are positioned as replacers, and they are such in almost every country in the world, are Black people, Muslims, and immigrants. Like those are the three groups. And of course, you have Black Muslims, immigrants, who of course receive in many ways the worst. And so it allows. I think it's important for Black people to recognize the connection between the assault on diversity, equity, and inclusion programs with the assault on immigrants, because we have to remember that they're assaulting diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on the pretext that they are taking jobs from qualified white people. They are simultaneously arguing that immigrants are what? Taking jobs from people. So it's the same idea, right? Ultimately, and just as they're arguing that Muslims are taking the lives, right, of people. And so we have to, and so if we, and when I say we, when Black folks reinforce the idea that immigrants are invading the nation, I don't think we realize that we're reinforcing the ideas that are undermining our institution and our lives and our rights and our presence.
You're listening to Law and Disorder. I'm your host, Kat Brooks, in conversation with Dr. Ibram X Kendi. He has a new book out called Chain of Ideas, The Origins of Our Authoritarian Age. All right. The book positions Great Replacement Theory not as one idea, but a chain of ideas, links, if you will, hence the title of the book. I'm going to list them out for my listeners, but we're not going to have time to like touch on all of them. So I'm just going to ask you to touch on a couple as I move
Sure.
through them. But especially link 10. I want to be sure that we have time to talk about link 10. So listeners, link 1, white people lose out as people of color gain. And these are the names of the chapters, y'all. I think folks can grasp that one. Link 2, racial inequity data should be ignored. Link 3, racism is biological prejudice and interpersonal discrimination. Say more, please.
Sure. And just to give some context, these links are the ideas that make up Great Replacement Theory. And so in the case of link 3, they want racism to be defined as biological prejudice, because many of the mainstream Great Replacement theorists are arguing that what the problem is the cultures of, let's say, peoples of color. That is what is poisoning the nation. That multiculturalism or pluralism is leading to the Great Replacement. And then they want to be able to turn around and say that's not racist, because I'm not talking about biological prejudice. I'm just saying that from a cultural standpoint, there's a problem. So they, typically and historically, people define racism in a way that excludes them. And then interpersonal discrimination, they want a single white person who tells themselves that they didn't get access to that opportunity because they are white to believe that that is the essence of racism, not the racial disparities that, let's say, Black people are more likely to be unemployed than white people. No, they want a person to think about their own individual experiences, because then that gives any white person the ability to tell themselves that they didn't get something because they're white, even as the data doesn't necessarily show that white people persons are underrepresented, let's say, in that particular institution. So they don't want people having a structural analysis, because that undermines their ability to argue that anti-white racism is on the rise.
Link 4, racism against people of color is over. Link 5, anti-white racism is on the rise. 6, we got to pause here. White Christians are indigenous to the nation. Sir? More, please.
So this is how you can have someone like Trump, whose mother uh, is an immigrant from Scotland, whose father was in his grandmother's womb when she migrated from Germany, uh, demonizing immigrants. Because ultimately, Great Replacement theorists position white people as eternal natives and people of color as eternal immigrants. And this isn't just in the United States, in which they replace the history of Native peoples or even the history of Black people. Most Black Americans actually are more likely to have traced their ancestry to the founding era than more white Americans. They don't want to essentially sort of talk about, you know, that demographic history, because then it makes it harder for them to argue that immigrants are destroying the nation when they are the descendants of immigrants, right? So they have to position themselves as indigenous. They have to position themselves as native, even in countries like South Africa, even in New Zealand, even in certainly in Australia, even descendants of Jewish migrants from Europe, positioning themselves as indigenous, to the area we call Palestine, and then arguing that Palestine doesn't exist and Palestinian culture doesn't exist. This is critical in order to position peoples of color as the replacers.
All right, Jill. 7, fight for freedom as patriots like the nation's founders. 8, stand in the legacy of anti-slavery, anti-colonialism, civil rights activism, and anti-fascism. You want us to pause there for a second?
Well, I think we've heard that again and again when we've seen people who are seeking to conserve racism arguing that they're acting on the principles of Martin Luther King Jr., and they quote one line from one speech out of context.
9, insurrections against democracy protect the nation. And then let's settle here for a bit. Fight for privileges provided by dictators instead of power provided by democracy.
Yeah, this is the ultimate goal of great replacement theory. This is when these propagandists know that the chain has fully fastened around someone's mind. When people are clamoring for dictators on the pretext that all they really care about is the maintenance of their privilege. And so the dictator comes in and is like, I will maintain your privilege, but you're not going to. And then they simultaneously strip away their rights and freedoms, and most importantly, their power. And so it is really a distinguishing of privilege from power. And basically saying to these folks, that's all I'll maintain. I'll maintain your privilege. You'll be able to have more than those black folks or those immigrants or those Muslims, but you're certainly not going to have any electoral power or any economic power or any cultural power. I will dominate you, but in exchange for maintaining your privilege, you have to submit to that domination.